Hi, I hope you're all well. My name is Tia Undu. I'm a second year PhD at the University of Leicester. I'm currently in the analysis stage of my project, so today I'll give a brief overview of the project as a whole, and then I'll zone into what I want to talk about more specifically, which is the methodology, how I found conducting an intersectional analysis of urban regeneration, and what I found so far. So my research examines the urban regeneration policies enacted in Tottenham, an area in the North London borough of Haringey, following the 2011 riots, which were instigated by the police's killing of Mark Duggan, a black man from an estate in Tottenham called Broadwater Farm. Following the 2011 Tottenham riot, which had led to further riots across other parts of London and England, the Greater London Authority and Haringey Council thought about how they could ameliorate the deep-seated issues of racial inequality and poverty that underpin these riots. Now, if you want to understand the kind of racial inequality that we're talking about, if you look at the map of the borough of Haringey, what you'll see is that there are stark socioeconomic differences across the Haringey borough. You have the wealthy, predominantly white population in the west of the borough, and the poor, predominantly black and ethnic minority population in the east of the borough. Now, I lived in Tottenham for over 20 years, and at the time of the Tottenham riot, I lived in Northumberland Park, which is an area of Tottenham that you can see at the top right-hand side of the map of the borough. So as I said, Haringey Council, which is the local authority for Tottenham, and the Greater London Authority, which was headed by the then London Mayor, Boris Johnson, really thought long and hard about how they can ameliorate these issues of racism and deprivation. And as a result, they came up with this. Yes, they thought if we bring in some coffee shops, several blocks of flats, and a cycle lane, this is going to solve all the problems for sure. So, given their ingenuity, while I used to live in Northumberland Park in Tottenham, I now live 40 miles away, having been socioeconomically displaced, despite so much of my life still happening in and around the Tottenham and North London area. Now, my life has changed considerably, and I cannot say that it is totally for the better, so I can relate to the concerns of other Tottenham residents. As a result, this experience initiated my interest in how different people experience urban regeneration in Tottenham. Residents' voices were excluded from the decision-making process, and so there exists among Tottenham's existing predominantly black and ethnic minority population worries about their potential displacement too, at the expense of an influx of middle-class residents into Tottenham. In fact, parts of Tottenham have already changed dramatically. Now, the specific part of Tottenham that I'm researching is a council estate called Broadwater Farm. It's a total of 12 blocks of various designs and capacities, some of which are interconnected, and so it has over 1,000 dwellings and up to, I'd say, 4,000 residents. And my aim is to understand the differences and similarities in how its residents are experiencing these urban regeneration policies and why, especially given the diversity of the population. What's important to note is that the estate was the location of the 1985 Broadwater Farm riot that occurred following the death of a resident during a police raid. And the estate was originally housing mainly working class white and Jamaican residents who have over the decade experienced high levels of disrepair in these blocks due to leaks and a lack of maintenance, alongside continued discrimination across various other socioeconomic domains as well. And as a result, the area has become known as a black area, with black essentially standing for poor black criminals, which was reflected in the discourse over the decades, but was heightened during the times of the 1985 and the 2011 riots. So despite the demographics of the estate changing quite a lot, I guess basically because of the accession of various Eastern European countries into the EU and the migration that followed, as well as, for example, the migration of, let's say, the Somali population due to the civil war, the demographics of the estate has changed both racially and ethnically. In fact, the estate is more diverse than ever. However, despite this, there is indeed an unceasing political and media representation of Broadwater Farm as black. There's one stigmatized label to represent a range of people from various racial and ethnic backgrounds that is basically a form of essentialism and is actually largely exclusionary. It legitimates the blanket application of identity-blind urban regeneration policies, as well as depoliticizing any resistance that could emerge from those protesting against the urban regeneration policies. I think slightly in the same way that the label depoliticized the 2011 riots, because when you label people black, you're labeling them as criminals who should not get a say in how things go. Important to note is the fact that Broadwater Farm is not only feeling the effects of Tottenham-wide gentrification, but 2 of the blocks are also subject to demolition orders based on the safety recommendations following the Grenfell Tower tragedy in 2017, although whether demolition was the only option remains to be seen. While Broadwater Farm has experienced regeneration schemes extensively following the 1985 riot, the possibility of gentrification through this capitalist type of regeneration that we're commonly seeing the rise of is a factor that wasn't there in previous decades of regeneration that occurred. My main research question is, in what ways has urban regeneration policy caused differentiated experiences for Broadwater Farm's racially and ethnically diverse population? I wanted to examine the wider context in which regeneration or gentrification is occurring, see how these experiences relate to the policies themselves, and I wanted to understand how racism and other forms of discrimination operate in an interconnected manner. Besides this, I wanted to be able to make policy recommendations. This is not a homogeneous group, so I need to build on research that acknowledges difference. So my research builds on the extensive work of Loretta Lees on displacement and how urban regeneration is essentially state-led gentrification. My work also considers the London-based studies of Tim Butler, who utilizes Bourdieu's social reproduction concepts, including economic, cultural, and social capital, and habitus, to understand differentiated experiences of regeneration or gentrification. However, Butler's work largely has a preoccupation with examining gentrification experiences of the incoming middle class into gentrifying areas, I think at the expense of understanding existing residents' experiences. Also, the large body of work on gentrification predominantly focuses on class analysis at the expense of race, even when some of these studies examine gentrification within predominantly Black and ethnic minority neighborhoods. Apart from that, my research also built on gentrification studies that do consider race. However, these largely emerged from the US context through the work of scholars such as Lance Freeman. Often, however, there is this preoccupation with race at the expense of other, also relevant aspects of identity. So my work also uses Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality to examine how gentrification outcomes in diverse neighborhoods are differentiated due to the interconnected nature of other structural relations, for example, ethnicity, gender, class, disability, etc., etc. So in this sense, my work follows that of scholars such as Caitlin Cahill and Derek Hyver, who use intersectionality as a framework for analyzing gentrification. However, as Loretta Lees highlighted in 2011, work in the UK context needs to build on but not directly copy the work done in the US, as there are contextual differences. And so for me, one of those differences includes the need to consider ethnicity as a variable for analysis, given Broadwater Farm's ethnic diversity. So my framework essentially looks like this. I cannot say for sure that my interpretation is 100% correct, but I love a good funnel diagram anyway, so I'll put it in. Given my work's foundation in work on habitus and capital and race and intersectionality, I extended Bourdieu's theory of social reproduction by incorporating critical race theory to highlight the centrality of racism, classism, and various other intersecting relations that inform why regeneration/gentrification is experienced and reproduced in the way that it is. Given the significance of regeneration/gentrification through urban policy, I consider policy doxa as well, as despite the popularity of Bourdieu's concepts of field, capitals, and habitus, doxa are the naturalized rules or assumptions that govern social relations in the field of gentrification and are identifiable in the policies. If we understand this in relation to critical race theory, we're looking at how dominant ideologies of supremacy, identity blindness, identity neutrality, and meritocracy are embedded in policy discourse to create disparate outcomes. Now, you may have noticed that I use terms such as identity blindness rather than, say, color blindness. And this is because I'm conducting an intersectional analysis where various forms of blindness occur. So not only color blindness, but let's say, for example, disability blindness or gender blindness, which intersect. So my theory is that when we examine policy doxa in relation to capitals and habitus, this explains the differentiated experiences and practices observed in Broadwater Farm. Now, the significance of critical race theory and intersectionality in my research raised important ethical issues for me. While intersectionality has been used in urban studies to analyze the state-led gentrification of racially segregated neighborhoods or differentiated outcomes or impacts for groups with specific intersectional identities, many of these studies fail to meet the ethical values that underpin the concept, as well. Firstly, the Black civil rights and Black feminist roots that underpin the concept are often ignored in human geography studies, with researchers failing to challenge power imbalances between marginalized participants and academic researchers. Secondly, human geography research has mostly been exclusionary, employing a black-white or other ethnic minority white dichotomy in intersectional research, an approach which ignores the racial and ethnic diversity of many urban neighborhoods, including Broadwater Farm and Tottenham more widely. So it's been said that even some of the more recent literature has excluded important groups such as those who are homeless and the young black male population. Resultantly, it's been argued that the methodological and ethical advancements in human geography are behind the ethical standards that intersectionality requires. Now, thirdly, intersectional research has been exclusionary in that one intersectional group is focused on without a consideration of examining phenomena in relation to other groups in order to obtain, say, a more comprehensive understanding. Now, these are issues that have been documented more widely in the field of intersectionality, including by seminal scholars such as Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw herself. Now, the significance of critical race theory and intersectionality in my research raised important ethical issues for me. While intersectionality has been used in urban studies to analyze the state-led gentrification of racially segregated neighborhoods or differentiated outcomes or impacts for groups with specific intersectional identities, many of these studies fail to meet the ethical values that underpin the concept, as well. Firstly, the Black civil rights and Black feminist roots that underpin the concept are often ignored in human geography studies, with researchers failing to challenge power imbalances between marginalized participants and academic researchers. Secondly, human geography research has mostly been exclusionary, employing a black-white or other ethnic minority white dichotomy in intersectional research, an approach which ignores the racial and ethnic diversity of many urban neighborhoods, including Broadwater Farm and Tottenham more widely. So it's been said that even some of the more recent literature has excluded important groups such as those who are homeless and the young black male population. Resultantly, it's been argued that the methodological and ethical advancements in human geography are behind the ethical standards that intersectionality requires. Now, thirdly, intersectional research has been exclusionary in that one intersectional group is focused on without a consideration of examining phenomena in relation to other groups in order to obtain, say, a more comprehensive understanding. Now, these are issues that have been documented more widely in the field of intersectionality, including by seminal scholars such as Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw herself. So as an attempt to acknowledge these issues, I decided to include as many participants with as many intersectional identities as possible. I also used co-production to first establish the community's focus for the research and how we could best research it together. Findings from the initial stage of the co-production indicated that both policy decisions and policy implementation are priority research areas for residents. It highlighted that an inclusive research process was important to the residents and should be maintained. It also highlighted that the methodology needed to be diversity responsive, as the area is home to people with different backgrounds and needs. It highlighted the importance of intersectionality, and residents felt that locality was also a social construct that needed to be investigated in more depth. The methodology needs to prioritize choice, convenience, accessibilities, as many of the residents are experiencing displacement and have various other commitments. So essentially, the data to be collected and the methods to be used felt quite broad. Some of the findings that I'll be sharing with you today come from the second phase of this project, which is the actual main study. I currently have around 50 participants who are current and former residents of the estate, and there's an extensive range of intersectional identities. In fact, there is limited intersectional identity overlap between most of the residents. So my research required a methodology that meets the needs of residents in that a variety of participatory, convenient and accessible methods could be used, making the research as diversity responsive as possible. It also needed to be theoretically relevant in that it allows the impacts of structural relations within urban regeneration to be examined, and it would need to be discipline relevant, allowing for experiences of spatial changes on Broadwater Farm to be captured too. For this reason, I chose institutional ethnography, which, although underutilized in human geography, is useful for analyzing everyday experiences of space and place. So at a glance, there are 3 stages to my institutional ethnography approach. Step 1 is essentially me collecting data from residents about their experiences. In step 2, I analyze the urban regeneration policies, and in step 3, we bring all this data together from the first 2 steps, and we use that to decide policy recommendations together. Now, in reality, I've gone back and forth between the first 2 steps as I've been analysing policies and conducting elite interviews alongside the research with the residents. Now, although my methodology only shows one method, this is because although options were left open to residents' preferences, and while I tried to promote a broad range of methods, residents chose face-to-face, telephone and WhatsApp interviews over more creative and group-based methods because they simply didn't have the time to engage in anything too time-intensive and longer terms because of jobs and caring responsibilities and other things. Now, this third step of the institutional ethnography is supposed to be done alongside residents from Broadwater Farm. But how likely this is, I don't know, given our current predicament with COVID-19. Today, I'm only going to talk about some of my process in step 1. So I started off doing the usual stuff. I transcribed the digital interview data. Some participants did not wish to be digitally recorded for obvious reasons, so I typed up the written notes. I then did 3 levels of coding, and then came the hard part of analyzing the data using Bourdieu and CRT framework. Intersectionality states that we can't analyze experiences based on each structural relation individually, which equates to an additive approach, and that instead we must consider the combined implications of subjugation and privilege in any experience based on the intersectional identity as a whole. So firstly, I analyzed migration, including, for example, the type of migration that the resident has experienced and the relevance of UK and EU policies on migrant groups' experiences. And I researched how each person or group's identity has been constructed in the UK and the impact of these realities on their habitats and capitals. Secondly, I researched how past and current policies in a range of socioeconomic domains influence different researchers' capitals and habitats in the UK based on their intersectional identity, as these realities influence how regeneration or gentrification is currently being experienced. Thirdly, something that did emerge is the influence of landscapes on experiences of regeneration or gentrification. Now, it could be the physical landscape, which was pertinent to those with disabilities, and for example, the Somali and Eastern European women in the study. It could be ethnic landscape in terms of the sense of belonging and actual use of space and certain groups' visible stamp on certain parts of the estate. And also, for example, symbolic landscape, which was particularly pertinent to the regeneration or gentrification experiences of Black, West African, or Black Caribbean women and young Black men. Following this, the relevance of contextual influences on the experiences had to be confirmed with participants, and I'm now at the point of comparing the experiences of different groups for similarities and differences to explain the ways in which urban regeneration policies have disparately impacted Broadwater Farm residents based on their intersectional identity. To demonstrate my approach to analysis, take for example Adams. Although she expresses potential negative impacts relating to her income, for example, Adams perceives that Broadwater Farm's regeneration could potentially have significantly positive impacts for her if her block gets demolished and she is displaced. Adams perceives displacement positively because her habitus is informed by her experiences as a working-class Black Sierra Leonean female Broadwater Farm resident who is the primary carer of a son. In Broadwater Farm, outcomes for young Black boys, such as Adams's son, are often impacted severely by criminal exploitation and violence by local gangs due to high levels of marginalization. However, crime also plays out in relation to Broadwater Farm's own ethnic landscape, which sees young Black boys, predominantly of Jamaican and West African descent, who have a very visible presence and sense of belonging which is played out in certain parts of the estate, which, alongside Broadwater Farm's symbolic landscape of young Black criminality, makes these boys a target for discriminatory police relations. This means that Adams' son is not only at risk of harm from local gangs, but also the police. Therefore, Adams's intuition is therefore to do everything that she can to keep her son safe. As such, she perceives that she can benefit from displacement. Secondly, Adams has low capitals. Examining intersecting factors chronologically, this is because Adams fled civil war in Sierra Leone, coming to the UK as a working-class refugee, meaning that she had no assets. Following her settlement in a place not suitable for her Black son, Adams began working, and her intersectional identity once again contributed to her lack of capitals needed to leave the area, as she experienced de-skilling as her cultural capital from Sierra Leone was void in the UK. Meanwhile, research shows that Black working-class women are disproportionately excluded from higher earning employment once relevant factors have been controlled for, and are therefore overrepresented in low-paying sectors such as health and social care, which coincidentally happens to be Adams's sector. As a part-time healthcare worker who feels the need to be around for her children as much as possible due to crime in the neighborhood, alongside gender barriers regarding a lack of appropriate and affordable childcare solutions, as women are disproportionately primary carers, Adams experiences the lack of economic capital necessary for moving of her own accord. Now, this is just a brief overview of Adams' situation, but given her capital and habitus, Adams perceives gentrification-induced displacement to be positive. What's important to note then is that intersectional experiences of subjugation and privilege are complex, as the same identity memberships that have caused her disadvantage more generally, and also in respect to her negative experiences that she may face because of gentrification, are also the basis for her perceiving gentrification positively, as her earnings are low enough for her to be displaced into other council housing, while some of the other participants in the study earn above the council house earning threshold, meaning that some have concerns about being displaced into unaffordable housing association or private rent accommodation. For this reason, Adams relies on her continued economic subjugation, at least for now, in order for this positive impact of displacement to be realized. This opens up conversation beyond the idea that displacement is always experienced as a negative impact and that staying put is always the aim of residents in a gentrifying neighbourhood. For sure, some of the intersectional groups are planning on staying put. That's the aim, especially, for example, Somali women who have expressed that they have already experienced displacement from their country of origin. They generally expressed a cultural preference to stay put. But there do seem to be patterns emerging that highlight the aspirations of these groups, which I don't think would be so poignant if the participant sample wasn't so diverse. So now the challenge is, how am I going to look across all of these different experiences when examining what regeneration or gentrification means to the community as a whole and what it says about the process of gentrification with so many intersectional identities to consider? So I'm working on this right now. So, back to the question, am I using intersectionality for examining diversity in regeneration or gentrification experiences right? Well, the truth is I have no idea. I've attempted to tackle the issues of doing anti-racist and anti-discriminatory research using co-production and an intersectionally diverse sample group, although I feel that in many respects the participatory element of this study has somewhat fallen flat, and I will continue to face challenges given the challenging time we're facing right now. But what I can say is that I do believe that using critical race theories focused on race and intersectionality alongside Bourdieu's concepts to examine gentrification in such a diverse neighbourhood has produced some interesting findings so far. So thank you for listening to my presentation on whether or not I think I'm doing an intersectional analysis of state-led gentrification experiences correctly. Now obviously there's going to be some scope for improvement, so I genuinely look forward to your observations, suggestions and questions. Thank you.